History 1. I've been a registered land surveyor since I was 17 years old. There was one job outside of Tucson in the 90s that scared the bejesus out of me. I was doing a survey for a series of massive developments well outside the community, probably 30 miles from the city limits. I got out there about 5 a.m. to get a good amount of work done before the temperatures soared past 100 degrees. Surveying in the desert is brutal. Don't let anyone tell you different. Much of the work involved bushwhacking and hill busting, walking miles and miles in uncharted terrain. At that time, every single part of the desert around Tucson was being developed, no matter how rugged or overgrown. People were buying up land, slicing it into lots, and dropping the framework for future cities. What were just lots and hills back then are now bustling metropolitan areas. When I arrived at the job site, I did the first thing all surveyors do: set up base camp. Surveying relies on satellites, GPS, and exact coordinates, so you need a hub to relate all the data back to. Sometimes you'll see a tripod with a box and antenna on top, a crate on the ground with some wires running between them. All that good stuff. I would go out with a GPS rod and send coordinates back to base camp. Everything got set up and I went about my day. The terrain was harsh and unforgiving, with the Arizona sun beating down on me like a hammer on a nail. I carried more equipment than I needed, which slowed my pace even more. A magnetized metal detector, hatchet, hammer, bush knife, rope, hand shovel, and of course, a .32 caliber pistol stuffed inside my boot, mostly for snakes or coyotes. In the early hours, I didn't see the need for a big heavy gun that I might lose when a cheap little one would do. All this stuff hung from my belt or a backstrap slung across my body. You never know what you might need when you find a property corner. Some are buried under 18 inches of dry, impacted soil you can't get through with a shovel, hence the hatchet and hammer to chew away at it one chisel swing at a time. Once it loosens up, the hand shovel comes into play. Anyway, it must have been around 10 o'clock in the morning when I crested a hill and saw a bridge way off in the distance. Nothing special, just a low concrete thing out in the middle of nowhere, seeming to serve as an old ranch road crossing. I gave it zero thought as I huffed to the next checkpoint. I was already through the first property and on to the next lot. If I kept my pace, I could have the whole job done by 2 p.m. The hillside I was descending was pretty challenging, with a big gulch waiting at the bottom. I'd have to drop into it with all my equipment and then climb up the other side, every inch of the way blanketed with razor underbrush and cactus. Scorpions, rattlesnakes, and the elusive Gila monster made this area treacherous. A chance encounter with anything like that could be fatal. The Gila monster is Arizona's miniature Komodo dragon, one of the only poisonous lizards in the world, known for being aggressive. It's not the toxicity from the bite that'll kill you, but the disorientation, swelling, and burning. Then comes the nausea, and a rapid change in blood pressure making you dizzy. Hiking back to your truck becomes impossible if it's more than a couple of miles. The sun will finish you off. That's the stuff that preoccupied my mind as I pushed through the particularly overgrown areas. By the time I reached the ravine, my arms were sliced to ribbons from the thorns, and I could barely breathe from the heat. It didn't matter, though. This line of work makes men into metal. I dropped into the sandy gulch, wiped my brow, and started climbing up the other side. I could have wandered up or down either direction to find a spillway, but I needed to walk the property line as close as possible. I tagged 2 more points with GPS before I got out of the underbrush. It was spiderwebbed with all kinds of dumpy little creek beds, constantly making me go up and down. By the time it spat me into a dust bowl, I was ready for a break. With just my luck, that bridge I saw earlier was only a quarter mile or so away. It was literally the only shade for who knows how many godless miles out there. The bridge now became my mission. I could feel the skin on my neck blistering so quickly that it was just peeling away rather than burning. I get skin cancer removed from some part of my body at least once every couple of years. It's just part of the trade. The guys I really feel bad for are the ones that can't tan. I get dark, but some guys just burn, and burn, perpetually pink like boiled lobsters. As I got close to the underpass, I saw there was an object under there already, something big. It wasn't until I got within a few hundred yards that I made out it was a dumpster. Again, I didn't think anything of it. This was desert ranch land. A dumpster by the bridge made sense in my mind. It almost seemed bustling for out there. Once I got within 25 yards, the weirder details started to present themselves. First, there seemed to be some kind of scripture written all over the outside of the dumpster. Then I saw tracks in the dirt and sand stretching out as far as I could see until they disappeared into the desert. This thing wasn't dropped off, it was pushed out there. Remember, I'm more than 30 miles from anything resembling a city. Whoever pushed this thing did it for days, maybe weeks, to get it to the only spot of shade in the whole area. I stepped under the bridge and started unloading my equipment. I can't describe how it felt to get the sun off my back, like I'd escaped certain death. I took a few slugs from my canteen and discarded it. The plan was to sit and breathe for a few minutes before rounding the last segment of the last property. Behind me, I heard one of the plastic covers on the dumpster flip open and slam into the steel body, followed by a scraping sound. I turned around just in time to see a man emerge from the darkness of that container. He looked like a psycho, bald, with a clearly DIY shave job, cuts and nicks all over his scalp. He stood straight up in the mouth of the dumpster, his hands down in the steel container making that scraping sound. Before I could react, the guy grabbed the lip of the container and leapt out like a stuntman. It was like he flew through the air for a moment. It caught me so off guard that in my attempt to backpedal, I tripped over my boots and equipment and landed flat on my ass. The idea of calling someone didn't even occur to me. There was a car phone in my truck, but that was 5 or 6 miles away, maybe further. I was on my own with this guy, and I had clearly stepped into his territory. When I fell down, the guy got really excited and started waving the thing around he was using to make that scraping noise. It was a 16-inch screwdriver with the top inch broken off, leaving just a warped, twisted hook of metal. It looked like a goddamn sword at first glance. He crouched low, almost eye level with me, then started coming for me, arms outstretched, weapon before him. His face was every shade of crazy you can imagine, eyes bulging, dried blood down his chin, and muttering some indiscernible language. I scrambled backward as quickly as possible, doing a half crab walk to create some distance. It wasn't quick enough. This guy was on top of me in a second, waving the screwdriver and trying to hit me in the head. If he jumped on me, I'd be out of moves, and gravity would give him the advantage in stabbing me. I did the one thing that I thought might work. I reached for my boot and yanked out that little black pistol. I held it barrel up so he could see the full frame, then pointed it right in his dirty face. He froze up just like I wanted him to, and took a couple of steps back. With one hand posted behind me, I jumped to my feet and moved backward until I hit my back on the wall. I didn't know if this guy had any friends out there. I'd already been surprised once. It sure as hell wasn't happening again. With the nature of our Mexican standoff, the guy found some words. He asked me what I was doing out there. I told him I was working, that I was a surveyor, and I had no interest in disturbing him. The whole interaction was an accident. I even offered him an apology. I'm not heartless. I know a guy down on his luck when I see him, but he was also coming at me with a short sword. If it's going to be one of us to get killed, it's going to be the other guy every time. That's just how I was raised. I asked how long he'd been living out there, to which he shrugged and started laughing. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was something off about him beyond the normal homeless demeanor. Tucson in the 90s had one of the largest homeless camps in the country, so I was used to seeing folks like him in my line of work. But this guy was different. I looked back over to the dumpster, the weird scripture all over it. It made me think of the movie The Exorcist. His jerky movements reminded me of possession. He went over to the equipment I'd discarded and started rifling through it. I uttered the sternest warning I could. All that stuff was very expensive, and unless he wanted trouble, he better leave it alone. He shrugged, growled, and kept poking through it. He didn't take anything, but he sized up every little item like each one was the Holy Grail. After he was satisfied, he tucked the screwdriver in his pants, dropped to all fours, and crawled back into the dumpster. At this point, I shuffled down the bridge wall until I was back out under the sun. I watched him crawl back into the dumpster, lift the lid closed, but he kept watching me. The plastic lid stayed open by just a couple of inches, and in the shadows, I could see his eyes and forehead. He watched me the whole time I gathered my stuff. Against my better judgment, I continued on and finished the job by afternoon. I circled the bridge at a healthy distance, varying between 1 to 2 miles. You better believe I kept an eye out for that weirdo or anyone else skulking around. That was one of those jobs where rattlesnakes and other desert dangers took a back seat to a truly unpredictable danger. I saw him get out once or twice, throwing a fit in the shadows beneath the bridge. At one point, I think he was throwing rocks against the steel shell. When I hit my last coordinate and started back toward my truck, I saw something even stranger. My new friend had pushed his dumpster out from under the bridge and was apparently setting sail. I watched him continue to push that thing through rocks and sand, using boards to navigate the uneven terrain. It was an absolutely wild thing to see. True innovation. Too bad it was wasted on such a strange errand. I returned to that area sporadically over the next year for additional coordinate data, but I never saw that man again. History 2. I want to start this off by saying 2 things. First, I'm not much of a writer, so I'm going to try to keep all of this simple and straight to the point. The other thing is, I don't believe in ghosts or spirits of any kind, so you'll have to come to your own conclusion about this experience that we had. I grew up in a small town in the Southwest, not desert, but heavily forested high country. When I was in high school, my friends and I heard a rumor from upperclassmen. The rumor was that there was a condemned cabin somewhere in the woods outside of town. It was known as the Indian Slaughterhouse. The upperclassmen spreading this rumor said it earned its name during the town's settling in the 1800s. Any natives that resisted moving to the local reservation were dragged out to this cabin and mercilessly tortured, if not killed. I know what you're thinking. This is the most politically incorrect legend you've ever heard. Well, this was 20 years ago, before kids were as considerate as they are today. The thing is, some adults around town found old newspaper clippings that actually corroborated the story we heard. There was an old shack that was known as the Native Conversion Camp. When we heard this, some of my friends became a lot more interested. We actually liked the idea of a local haunt, but the fact that it might have some historical accuracy was next level. At the time, only one of my friends, Jake, was old enough to drive, so a few of us piled into his old Chevy Blazer and started tooling around the forest back roads in search of that cabin. It took us most of a semester, but after searching enough ground and asking around, we got a lead. Another group of kids had come upon the dilapidated cabin out northeast of town, a couple of miles beyond the last neighborhood. They said you had to park at the end of a dead-end dirt road, then walk for about half a mile. We knew the road they were talking about and decided to check it out for ourselves. There were 4 of us that went. We turned the car around when we parked so we could leave quickly if needed. We had flashlights and a couple of pocket knives, your standard high school boys' adventure equipment. Jake locked his car up, and we walked as a unit over to where we were told the trail began. Sure enough, we saw the beginnings of a little path that led into the wilderness. It was down a steep but short slope. Beyond that, it looked relatively flat. Still, no one advanced down the initial hillside because it was so rugged and viney. Once you commit to walking down that slope, there's no turning around. So if anything happens down there, you're committed. I remember taking a deep breath and looking around the forest. Because of the decline, I was looking 10, maybe 15 feet up the tree trunks because of the ground level difference. They were swaying gently, but there wasn't any wind. The sun was setting so fast that I could see the shadows overtaking the forest. What was twilight when we arrived was rapidly becoming darkness. It was creepy. I didn't like it. But in that moment, something occurred to me. This was all too perfect. Some dumb seniors gave us a tip to come check out this particular stretch of woodland. There's no traffic, no quick escape. I suddenly envisioned a group of douchebags hidden in the foliage below, waiting to scare the crap out of us after we started looking around. It was the exact kind of prank I would pull on my little sister. Now that I had created doubt for myself, descending down the slope didn't seem as intimidating. I took a deep breath and took my first step, and then impulsively shouted something that I regret to this day. As I was making my way down that treacherous hill, I yelled at the top of my lungs, "All right, you stupid ghosts, show me what you got." Several things happened the moment I spoke. The first and most obvious was the screaming that suddenly came out of the forest in front of me. It wasn't just one voice, not two or three. It sounded like dozens of different pitches all screaming, all layered together at once. There were so many voices it sounded distorted to me, but that could have been the shock. There was so much sound that it took my breath away, made me freeze up in panic. When that screaming started, the trees started thrashing like there was a nautical gale blowing around. Like I said before, there wasn't any wind of any kind. Still, the sudden motion lent to the idea of wind, and for some reason made me feel like I was drowning. Besides the trees, nothing else moved down below. No people. No bodies. Denial had taken over my mind at this point. I was sure this whole thing was still a prank. What else could it be? There must be 10, maybe 20 fellow students out here hiding amongst the trees, shaking them and screaming all just to get a reaction out of us. I turned back to my friends to explain this to them, that we'd been set up and whoever did it did a great job. When I saw the top of the slope, I found I was alone. My friends had turned tail and were bum-rushing back to the blazer, fully intending on leaving me out there. The denial in my brain unraveled. I realized there weren't any other cars parked out here. No one was laughing or saying gotcha. There was no prank. Whatever just happened, as strange as it may have been, was real. I started to panic, climbing my way back to the road just in time to see my buddies running so quickly that they were falling headfirst into the dirt. I could hear them screaming, even crying, desperate to get away from that tree line. Fortunately for me, my friends were too scared to get the keys in the ignition, so I jumped in the back seat before they could bail on me. We locked the doors and caught our breath, listening to the chaos outside die down into silence. I asked them if this was a setup. They all told me no. At this point, I was looking everyone in the eye, demanding to know if there was anyone out there messing with us. All of them were teary-eyed and adamant that none of this was planned. After a few minutes of collecting ourselves, we started talking about what to do. Jake, the guy who drove, really wanted to leave and come back when it was daytime. The rest of us were kind of here for the crazy. We wanted to at least go see the cabin. It took a good amount of convincing, but we all finally agreed and got back out of the car. I offered to lead the charge down the initial slope, but everyone agreed to go down together as a unit. We took slow, deliberate steps to the forest floor, this time not yelling any kind of challenge. There wasn't any screaming, there wasn't any wind. We made it down unscathed, and because of that, I gained a little confidence. Now, from what the seniors had told us, we needed to follow the trail in a big loop. They said it was a horseshoe-shaped trail that would take us to the cabin. It would be such a wide loop that after the halfway point, we would feel like we were walking in the wrong direction. They assured us to press on and keep going until we saw a building by a dry creek bed. The walk took about 10 minutes. Part of it felt exactly as they said it would. It was like we had somehow swung around and were walking right back toward where we left the car. As we pushed through this last stretch, we could hear footsteps in the fallen leaves around us. The forest was washed in moonlight at this point, but the canopy cast shadows all over. The result made us think we saw things, but looking back, I really don't think we did. Either way, after the last bend, there was the cabin. A big blocky building with a wide-angled roof. A rocky creek bed ran in either direction just behind it. Just as the upperclassmen said, the building was totally sealed up. And by that I mean there wasn't any glass. It looked all boarded up. There in the dark, we made a lap of it first, just to get an idea of the area and possible exits. If anyone was around, we'd also heard a story about a big pool behind that cabin where those torturers would wash the blood from their tools. To our surprise, there really was a bored-out area in stone where water would gather in a perfect little basin. At this point, one of my friends, Tom, told us a story he heard from his older brother. His brother and his group of friends had come out here once. While they were exploring the cabin, they heard hooves walking around through the creek, which had very little water in it. There was splashing and everything, so it had to be real. They went outside expecting to see an elk or a deer, but instead he said they found a horse and a rider in the dark. The person never looked up as he rode on by, slender and shirtless in the dark. Naturally, they all thought it was the ghost of a Native American. I think they made it up, though. But who really knows? It could have been a real horse rider. We live in a rural area with lots of ranches and farms. After inspecting the outside, which did have a little graffiti, you know, the usual kind, satanic 666S, pentagrams, all of that, we opened up the front door. It looked boarded up, but it was actually just really old. The oldest style of door I've ever seen. It swung right open, and inside we found exactly what we imagined. Rusty chains hanging from pegs in the ceiling. Rusted tools like saws and clamps hanging from walls, all still intact and present. The very few that had found this cabin had also left its twisted history behind for others to see. It turned out the windows weren't actually boarded up. They were just really old. You could either push them open for fresh air and sunlight, or pull and chain them closed at night to keep the cool weather out. It was primitive, to say the least bare bones type of architecture. We gave ourselves a little tour, sharing more stories we'd heard over the years. There was more random satanic graffiti, a small fire pit in a back room, and evidence of drug use needles and other stuff. Aside from that, we didn't hear or see anyone else in the building. At one point, everyone was sharing stories. For some reason, one of my friends, Bill, decided it was a good idea to open palm smack one of the slack covers that opened one of the windows. When we asked later why he did that, he said it was an impulsive thing to see how sturdy it was after all those years. Right after he initially smacked it, it made us all jump. We turned to face the wood paneling. When we saw his hand there, we all let out a sigh of relief. But in that second, something smacked the paneling from the other side in the exact same place. Bill pulled his hand back, his eyes huge. He said he could feel the vibration through the wood. After a moment of listening, we actually unslung the chain and pushed open the covers so we could see through the window. There was nothing out there, no person, no ghost. We did hear another bang come from the far side of the house, at which point we all decided it was time to go. It was a long trek back to the car. We jumped at every little sound and shadow along the path. We heard the same footsteps in the leaves, except this time it sounded like people running right on top of us. We'd whirl around, flashlight in hand, and see no one there, not even a leaf out of place. We got to the hill slope and this time allowed one person to climb at a time, the rest of us standing guard. I was last and ran up the ridge as fast as my legs would let me. We got into the car and made our escape with little issue. The only other thing that happened was when we came to the end of the dirt road that intersected with pavement. There was a fully intact elk skeleton lying in the road. It was white, stripped clean, had clearly been dead for years. That thing hadn't been there an hour or two earlier when we drove through. This was the only road to get back to the cabin, so we were sure it had been placed since our arrival. The only real guess that made any kind of sense was that it slid out of the back of someone's truck. But even then, that seemed pretty far-fetched. We hadn't heard any other engines in the area, hadn't seen headlights, and even then, why would their bed be open? It was weird, but we just drove around it and left. We came back the next week to see if it was still there, and there wasn't even a fragment of it left in the road. Here's a little bonus for being here this long. My friend Tom and I still live in the same town. He became a firefighter, and I work in education. Tom told me that he responded to a call out there within the last couple of years. There was a report of a dead body in the forest, in the area he knew as the slaughterhouse. He and his team arrived to find a younger white male, deceased, likely homeless, with strangulation marks around his neck. He was within 100 yards of that cabin. I have absolutely zero proof relating this incident to the other, but we both thought it was too weird to be just a coincidence. The cabin has since collapsed into itself in the last 10 years, and we've not taken the time to go back and visit. History 3. A couple of years ago, I was on a road trip for work, and most of it took me right into the middle of nowhere. One big stretch through New Mexico into Texas led me through lots of little scuzzy towns whose names I can't recall. There's one incident that goes down as the creepiest thing that's ever happened to me. Cut straight to the scene. I'm on day 4 of the drive and making pretty good time. On this particular day, though, I woke up late and got a late start. It's about sundown and I'm running out of gas, getting ready to stop like usual. Except I've only been driving for 6 hours when I planned on driving for 9 or 10. I hadn't made the progress I wanted to, so I decided to gas up and push on through the night. Many of these dusty highway towns have 24-hour accommodations, so I wasn't worried about finding a hotel somewhere. I roll into a gas station maybe 30 minutes later, just before I got the message on my dashboard. I park my truck, stretch my legs, and check my phone. As I'm doing this, I notice a guy sitting on the ground near the entrance to the gas station. He looks homeless, but he also looks upset. It's hard to explain. He just had this deep-seated frown on his face. I tried not to look at him and went about my business. I moved some stuff around in the back seat of my truck, double-checked my belongings, all the regular road trip stuff. Then I heard a sound behind me. I turned around to find the homeless guy. Here's the thing. He must have been close to 7 feet tall, the largest man I've ever seen. Not particularly bulky, just towering with big features, big hands, big nose, big head. The rest of him was just dirty and slender. He had some loose belongings, a blanket and an armload of various items. He asked me for a ride in the deepest voice I've ever heard. It was frightening in the sense that I felt truly powerless. This guy was so big he didn't even seem human to me, and he wanted a favor. How the hell do I say no to that? I don't think that was part of his plan. He just used his size to kind of force the answer he wanted. I didn't cave, though. I told him, "I'm sorry, I'm on the clock and it's a work truck, no passengers allowed. It even says so on the insurance." None of this was true, but it sounded like official mumbo-jumbo. Figured it'd get me out of any further request. The guy just kind of nodded and moved out of my way. I apologized again and said, "I passed a number of vehicles headed this way. Surely someone will help you out." In a panic to get away from this monster of a man, I just barreled into the convenience store to pay for my gas in person. It seemed like a perfectly logical thing to do, when in reality, I was just creating steps so I could be near another person. I got a big bag of jerky, a bottle of soda, and 16 gallons of premium. I asked about the guy outside and the clerk just shrugged, so I went on my merry way. When I got back to my truck, the guy was nowhere to be found, not even in his spot by the door. I put my stuff in my truck and dribbled the gas in the tank, kept an eye out in every direction for that 7-foot-tall hitchhiker. I didn't see him, so I pushed on, driving until 9 p.m. or so. Finally tired and having put the distance behind me that I desired, I rolled into some border town, secured a hotel room, and even found a little hole-in-the-wall bar that was still serving dinner. It was a dingy little wannabe Italian spot built inside a double-wide trailer. It had a low red light, vaguely racist decor on the walls, but was warm, and the food smelled amazing coming out of the kitchen. I settled in, ordered a beer, and zoned out on my phone. By my count, I'd gone over a little 200 miles since I stopped at that gas station. I was right on schedule. All was well. As I'm going over the map, I hear some incredibly heavy footsteps creak up the stairs and onto the porch of that bar and grill. They make their way to the door, which swings open. I see the frame of that homeless guy from the station. All I can see is his chest and shoulders because his head is too high for the door frame. He ducks down and creeps his way into the bar, shutting the door behind him. No one really says anything, but everyone gives him this lingering look as he strolls over to the bar. I don't really think anything of this at first until I remembered the distance I just crunched. This guy should be sitting under a flickering fluorescent light some 200 miles behind me. Yet here he was, like he rode in the passenger seat of my truck. That's when it clicked. I watched as the bartender told him he could have any table he liked. The guy took one right in front of me. He's practically staring at me with a grin over the top of my phone. When we had our encounter at the gas station earlier, this guy must have climbed into the bed of my truck. When I exited the gas station, I must have been so spooked that I was keeping an eye out around me, not really inspecting my truck at all. He probably just laid down flat the whole damn way, and I had no idea. He gave me a wink as if to confirm my internal reasoning. There was literally no other logical way that he could be here. I scarfed down the food I ordered, slammed a beer, and left the bar as quickly as possible. The hitchhiker ate a big bowl of spaghetti in true psychotic fashion, just staring me down the whole time. It was a long, sleepless night in my hotel room. I stared out from behind the blinds, making sure that creep wasn't sleeping in my truck or stalking me in any way. I didn't see him the rest of the night, but that didn't mean he wasn't around. Who knows? Maybe he got a ride with someone else, or maybe he just wanted to mess with me. Either way, I never want to meet that 7-foot-tall phantom ever again. History 4. This is going to sound fake, but I promise you it's not. After graduating college, my older brother Jeff wanted to spend a weekend camping at Lake Corona, outside Napa in California. His girlfriend at the time, Sarah, said we could use her godfather's boat, so we hitched it up and headed to Spanish Flat to dock. The bank of this lake is surrounded by sandy hills and rocky cliff sides in a bowl-like valley. It's not exactly easy to climb down in some areas. The landscape has a lot of trees and it's a very big lake, so it's possible to not see anyone around after sunset. People typically tie up their boats and camp out on the banks. We headed towards the southeast corner and found a nice spot. We swam for over an hour or two and then had dinner. I think it must have been around 7 or maybe 8 p.m. because the sun was setting. The lake was still and beautiful. Sarah suggested we climb up the side of the bank to find some wood for a campfire, so my brother and I climbed up trying to find dried pieces. We were far enough into the woods that we could see the boat and the lights. As we were digging around, we heard this sharp, horrifying, echoing scream. We ran to the tree line to find Sarah on the boat, yelling for us, crying and obviously panicked. We climbed down the side slowly. Jeff stopped and stared out onto the lake. There was something floating in the water. I looked out and saw something slowly drifting toward the shoreline. Jeff walked toward the boat and told Sarah to come stand by me. Then he walked to the edge of the lake and just stood there quietly. Sarah ran up to me, crying. I started to walk over to Jeff and he said, "I think it's a skinned animal. It doesn't have any skin." Just as he finished that sentence, we heard something else stumbling footsteps through the shoreline. We turned and saw a man coming straight at us. Sarah screamed again and backed up. Jeff and I stood shoulder to shoulder to confront this guy together. He pointed to the thing in the water and started clapping his hands together. He asked if we liked his handiwork, to which we asked if he did that. He said, "Of course," then said we needed to help him fish it out. We told him, "No thank you, please leave our camping area." But it was like he didn't even hear us. He just kept wandering up and down the shore, admiring whatever was in the water. I stood behind him and I could see it. The water was dark, but I could see some detail. It was floating chest down, and there was a big black garbage bag covering part of the back. It was too big to be a dog or anything. It didn't have a head, and I couldn't see if it had front legs or not. Whatever it was skinned. It drifted slowly, turning as it moved with the current. We stood there for a few moments, not saying anything. But I knew we were both thinking the same thing. Please don't let that be a person. Sarah suggested we pack up our chairs and get the hell out of there, so we did just that. Now that this wacko showed up, the only safe place was on the boat. We were literally just tossing our stuff up onto the deck, totally careless of the damage, so we clambered up after it and pushed off from the shore. Our new friend was too far away to stop us. He got to us by the time we had the engine going and backed off 20 feet. As we were backing out, I was driving the boat, so I didn't get a really good look, but Jeff looked over the edge and tried to get a better description of it. There was blood and other stuff, leaving a pretty steady trail behind it. A cloud so dark it could have passed for tar. Here's the craziest part. That guy dove into the water and started swimming after us. There's no confusing it. He was barreling right for the side of the boat. There's a small pole ladder in the back as well as various ropes hanging from the sides, so he could climb up if he got close enough. I really started trying to make some space between us, which deterred the guy who then chose to swim over to the floating partial corpse. Sarah covered her eyes and was freaking out. We headed back to the dock at Spanish Flat. As we tore off for the other side of the lake, Jeff looked back and shouted for us to look too. There was this little dinghy coming at us from a little further up the channel. It was small, maybe a 4-person craft, and the guy driving it looked a lot like the guy we saw on shore, mangy, disheveled. Just weird in general. He brought his little boat around to where the other guy was, and after that, we lost sight of them. All the more reason to get the hell out of there. Slowly, one breath at a time, we gathered ourselves to make our report. There is an office there for the park department or something, but nobody was there. We waited for quite a while until a lot attendant showed up, but he wasn't really a park ranger. We told him that we had a very serious report to make and left our names and numbers with him. By this time it was getting dark, and we really just wanted to leave. We drove to the closest gas station and left a note and number for the clerk to give to any rangers that stopped in. We got a call the next morning and all went in to file the paperwork. It was a quiet ride home. The rangers were completely blown away by what we told them. They said a few others had called in about a boat with the exact same description, but they were nowhere to be found. Jeff hasn't brought it up in years, but the last time he did, he said he didn't VJTMT want to guess what it was. He got a better look than me, but we didn't go back to that lake for another decade or so after. It still upsets me to think about it today.